This is Branko Malić of Kali Tribune with text-to-audio rendition of the article The Way the World Goes, Rene Guenon on The End. One ineradicable feature of human reason is its urge to grasp the first and last things, beginnings and the ends, whence and wherefores. Moreover, this is the point where both everyday understanding, the so-called common sense, and high speculatio meet. Most people will readily admit they can't explain how the gadgets they use every day work, but ask them how the world is going to end and you'll get more or less final answer. The thought dealing with these original and final realities gives birth both to myth, as a more or less veritable image of truth, and the science of metaphysics. Unfortunately, it also spawns what we call common sense in its pejorative, modern meaning. In example, to paraphrase Descartes, the knowledge obviously equally distributed to all, because everybody is certain that he possesses it in ample quantity. More precise and to the point, everybody has a right to have opinions, not seldom about things he knows nothing about. True epistemological value of such common sense was historically best summed up by Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry. Opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one. What makes it dangerous is its all-pervasiveness, its accessibility, and, above all, the origin of its curious certitude. This is, in paraphrase, where Harry really nailed that punk. The opinion is worthless because it is rooted primarily, and in fact exclusively, in quantity. In the lines to follow, we'll deal with this curious quality of quantity, its strange impetus to eradicate every qualification by assimilating it. No one can say that wisdom of Dirty Harry is not common sense, yet it directly contradicts the notion of common sense we just put forward. So how can it be? Common sense expounding nonsense and quantity expunging quality. One of the best, if not the best, modern minders of this curious riddle was French thinker Rene Guenon, whose crown literary achievement, which we'll use as a basis of exposition, is a book titled The Reign of Quantity and Signs of the Times, published in 1945. It is a final part of an informal trilogy of Guénon's books, preceded by East and West and Crisis of Modern World, dealing with what we attempted to name apocalypse. In example, the end of the world. Admittedly, the French author deals with both origin and the end, but while the former is discerned only by conjunction, the latter expounded, albeit not historically predicted, in astonishing clarity. Everybody has a notion of how the world will end. Some claim to know when. Rene Guenon, on the other hand, realized why it has to end. And in the process of explaining this insight, he reminds us of the proper meaning of the term apocalypse. Namely, great the end is not a catastrophe. It is, strictly speaking, the end to an age-old lie. Guénon's thought unravels around insight that this thing we call the world is in a progressive state of dissolution. This is something most scientific-minded people, nowadays meaning those who take what they see on Discovery Channel seriously, would probably, more or less cautiously, agree with. At least until they got struck with Guénon's explanation, why is this so? Namely, what do we really have in mind when we say the world? It is one of those curious expressions everybody understands, but when interrogated about them, yields unbelievably banal and vague definitions, showing that he or she in reality does not understand anything at all. And this displays precisely an instance of Dirty Harry-esque opinion as illusory knowledge of something that is always present, crucially important, seemingly obvious, but, when put to scrutiny, utterly mysterious. According to Guenon, one of the main tendencies of modern world is to kill off this mystery, eradicate the paths by which man can walk to clarify it, and replace it with counterfeit, to revoke the transparency of our very horizon and, quite literally, close the shutters over it. This is the tendency at first observable only by its symptoms. The modern common sense notion of the world, handed down by popular science, is that it is an actually or potentially infinite space, a cosmic sack full of void with occasional crumbs of matter. Are we entitled to call this a world? Guenon is unequivocal in saying no. The world can be understood, or better to say, encountered and lived in, only by ascending to its principles, in example, its origins, and that means by transcending it. The thing we have on our hands nowadays is a result of both anthropological and cosmological alienation from any semblance of transcendent origin and, at this advanced stage we call postmodern, an alienation from its effects too. The materialistic notion we just sketched is not even close to being the final world concept man will be forced to endure. On the contrary, it is merely a transitory, nowadays more or less obsolete, stage on the path to final alienation of man, not only from spirit, angel, soul, God, and consequent-wise religion, morality, aesthetics, in a word, from any kind of transcendence, but of matter and its incestuous bedfellow, the void, too. This is an epochal fulfillment of what Guénon calls the reign of quantity, a state in which all knowledge and all reality are divided in such a way that the only common denominator of anything becomes pure numerical multitude and spatial extension. The quality and quantity are categories, meaning primordial notions constituting both structure and meaningful expression of all manifest beings. They were for the first time expounded by Aristotle and later systematized and reinterpreted by a range of philosophers, from early Aristotelian commentators to Kant. Guénon mostly utilizes original Aristotle's expositions through its reinterpretation of thinkers of high Middle Ages, above all Thomas Aquinas. There the relation of quantity and quality is equated with the relationship of substance and essence. Guénon rightly suggests that this Latinizing of original Greek expressions is very misleading but can be used with certain reservations. Namely, in Aristotle, categories are not expounded as a system, in example, closed and complete construction comprising correct scientific inferences. They are, quote-unquote, beings said in a non-complex way, meaning expressions, mind you, not descriptions, expressions of things comprising both their inner structure and elements of judgments about them. The quantity, or as Aristotle puts it, answer to a question, how much, in Greek poson, is the expression of two things. One, the relation of individuals and magnitude. Something can have quantity in a discrete sense, as for instance the number, or in continuous sense, as for instance the line. Difference being that numbers, and curiously enough things numbered, can only exist individually, in example separately from one another. The magnitude can exist continually, in example their ends can meet, as is the case with geometrical elements like the line, where two lines meet in the point. Quality, or answer to a question, in what manner, in Greek poion, is an expression, or as Guénon would say, manifestation of form, in Greek eidos, which can be taken either as concrete something, in example this man, or as species, in example the man. Quality expresses the manner of being, as, for instance, is this man knowledgeable or is this man merely having an opinion? When these things, said in a non-complex way, get elevated to an epistemological status, in example when they become system of fundamental notions in which we comprehend things methodically, all knowledge gets informed by the way we prioritize the categories. Guénon claims that the modern world is a result of an age-old tendency to put the quantity in the forefront and express all the other categories, and this means the world as a horizon of comprehension in its terms. There is a curious thing about materialist outlook to life. Even materialists don't like being called materialists. Everyday usage of this term serves to denote a man whose main or only purpose in life is to amass some quantity of wealth. And this is something everyone despises, including materialist himself. Mass and wealth are, however, much broader terms than it seems at first sight. Man can amass wealth of information, or he can indeed amass a wealth of followers on Facebook. The science can amass a wealth of different primordial particles, as they call it, with exotic names, and have them sold to imagination of gullible smart asses via Discovery Channel as existing things, while they are in fact imaginary constructs. There's a whole lot of amassing to be had in this world. Namely, matter is commonly understood as a fabric of the world, or better yet, fabric of all individual beings. To an extent, this common notion is correct in the real common sense understanding, namely common sense as universal, albeit unexamined premonition of ontological truths every man possesses. Aristotle, who often used it as a starting point of his inquiries, can once again help us understand what this substrate of the world really is. Namely, he defines matter, in Greek hule, as a possibility of form. Therefore, the matter is not merely perceivable being, but anything that underlies some sort of intelligible structure. In that sense, we can safely say that letters or voices are matter of the word, where word is a form and as such the origin of qualification of the certain quantity of letters and voices. Rene Guenon expands on this notion by elevating the matter and form to a metaphysical origins, while utilizing scholastic notions of materia prima and materia secunda. The primal matter in this sense would be the original and all underlying foundation of the world, enlightened into existence by descent of forms. As such, and taken in itself, this original matter is completely incapable of existence by itself, because anything that is must have some sort of form. Here we must distinguish between form and figure, where form denotes that which we understand to be some being. In example, the term man in sentence this man, while figure is merely a visible shape, for instance, a geometrical figure. Now to return to everyday existence, it may seem a little off-handed to put in the forefront of materialism a man hell-bent on amassing something, be it wealth or information, instead of pointing out the one who considers matter to be origin and the end of all that can be known. However, this is precisely where Guénon shines. He demonstrates that scientific and everyday existence are inseparable. If materialism rules the knowledge, it is only because the world of everyday living has already become materialistic, and not the other way around. Guénon, however, doesn't deny correctness of inferences made by natural sciences in their proper fields. He just points out their worthlessness from the standpoint of truth. For him, at the time of writing Reign of the Quantity and the Signs of the Times, materialism is already a passé, a forfeit metaphysics. And it is a metaphysics because however it craves to escape the original causes and concentrate on empiricism, it has to employ them in a roundabout manner, which served to prepare the humanity and the world for the final phase of their descent below matter. The key to understand this both radical and astonishingly sensible position is the answer to a question: what is matter? We already pointed out that as an ontological principle it is a receptacle of a form. In the sense of an everyday world, in example what Guenon calls manifestation, matter is the foundation of individuum. This is what scholastics called materia secunda, the principle of differentiation of individuals participating in a single form or species. While every man is qualified as the man by his participation in the human nature, he is quantified as a man simply by being the separate body in the collective or aggregate of things we call man. And this is where things get really interesting. Individuum and individuation are in fact a principle and activity of separation and leveling out the differences, because quantity can exist only when there is an equalization of unequal things. Aggregate of individuum is not a unity because there is nothing common among them save for the absurdly enough their separateness. To stick to example at hand, if man is taken as individuum, then only thing that unites him with another man is that they are bodily separated. This, Guenon argues, is a flip side of metaphysical materialism, which makes it inherently contradictory. While matter is completely amorphous pseudo-thing that we must imagine as pure, formless continuum, if we foolishly start to rely on it as a ruling principle of knowledge, we end up with infinite separation because pure individuum cannot in any way be unified with other pure individuum. They are logically and ontologically same, yet we are at the same time forced to imagine them as completely separated. There is infinite tendency to equalize the individuums and at the same time infinite tendency to discern or separate them. For this reason, scholastics consider the individuum ineffable, unknowable, and, in its pure form, really impossible. The epochs of first mechanism and then materialism as an introduction into final stage of reign of quantity were prepared above all by Protestant Revolution, when all spiritual authority, in example, primacy of the transcendent principles mediated by Church, was rejected. This brought about a kind of free inquiry, which is in fact counterfeit because it presupposes individual and his will and reason as its origin, and matter as its final object. Adequatio rei et intellectus, this in Latin, this means the correspondence of the thing and the intellect, remained the proper definition of truth. Yet nature of res, in Latin this means the thing, change, or a reality. While Middle Ages still retained the notion of form, as they called it, substantial essence, to be discerned in judgment, the emerging new era counterfeited it into matter. The res became matter, and act of discerning the truth became reduction to knowledge of individuum, and it was originally made possible by notion that everyone can, and indeed should, discern revelation and the world, now understood as nature, over which looms eternally pissed off Deus absconditus, by his own individual devices. The result of this phenomenon, now more and more obvious in the solution of any semblance of unity of natural sciences, is anticipated in immediate dissolution of Protestant Reformation, in sects imagining the original state of Christianity, which was to be completely simple, bereft of all cultured man cannot explain on the grounds of his own individual needs, and brought down to meta-democratic criteria of being acceptable for everyone's individual taste. Descartes' founding of all certainty within a reflexive consciousness is the fulfillment of this process, and it is only made worse by his postulating of God as an infinite guarantee of knowledge and existence of res cogitans. Postulating the God means projecting one's own need and willy-nilly one's own image in order to reach Archimedean point of knowledge. It may seem odd, even preposterous, that modern materialism and its correlate, the rationalism, is in fact founded on imagination, the image of world as a mechanical being extending to infinity. But Descartes' own writings prove it. Throughout all his endeavors in mathematics, geometry, and physics, the true certainty is to be found in ego cogito, therefore in himself. Does this mean that Descartes' discoveries in natural sciences are merely products of his imagination? Yes, it means precisely that. The objectivity of knowledge, from Descartes onward, is forever conditioned by its subjectivity. While bashing one's head on the wall will produce a rather objective effect of smashing the head, it still tells nothing about wall, aside from the fact that it is thicker than one's head. It is almost unbelievable that for hundreds of years arguments such as this served to prevent humanity from exploring the non-material, in example qualitative domain, which was for men of antiquity self-evident realm of truth. By qualitative domain is meant everything that cannot be quantified and therefore unique. Guenon gives some examples of this in the qualitative dimension of space, as is, for instance, expressed in the division of the world into East and West, based on quite real, by human intervention, ineradicable essential differences. The undersigned, albeit modern man, can vouch for this from his own experience of growing up in a typical modernist plant state, seated right around the Theodosius border between Eastern and Western Roman Empire. It cannot be elaborated here, but suffice it to point out that the war that tore it apart in fact had a lot to do with this ignorance of some essential principle of carving out the social space, still exercising its effects on gullible moderns, of which the architects of modern states were obviously completely ignorant. On the other hand, Descartes' notion of space is the pure extension of matter functioning mechanically, which is in itself contradictory because mechanism is a manifestation of individuum. In example, it presupposes separation and not extension. But flip it however you like it. The argument of epistemological materialist will always be, look, if you don't believe it, bang your head against the wall. Well, it's no argument, rather a reminder that the great thing about the walls is that they treat all heads equally, so we can always test the hypothesis in concreto on materialist himself. However, not for long yet. Now we have post-humanists who seek to employ the pinnacle of contemporary science to change this necessary fact of material world, so instead of grasping the truth, there is a real chance of fulfilling the need for more humane walls. Nothing strange about that, as a real function of materialism is in fact fulfillment of basic human desires, and that's why, while everybody declaratively abhors it, people embrace it en masse. The materialism as doctrine, by which the world has no origin outside of its matter, serves above all to provide man with a sense of metaphysical certainty. It serves to ward off fear of something that lurks below it, and this fear is, as we shall see, very well founded. When reflecting on materialism, one encounters a strange contradiction. While materialist principles, when taken to their logical extremes, retain dark and pessimistic implications in accordance with the being they reflect, the materialist outlook to life is optimistic to a point of insanity. Moreover, everybody shares in it to an extent, whether consciously or unconsciously. Everything we nowadays call humane, all those UNICEF tailored declarations of human rights, all those martyrs of science and progress are being presented as a pinnacle of optimism, while at the foundation lays the amorphous abyss. One of the reasons for this is the fact that the image of, say, Bertrand Russell as a paragon of humanist morality was created by members of his own class and hence does not reflect the fact that man was occasionally quite malevolent lunatic, only that he protested nuclear weapons which he formerly endorsed. However, there is a deeper reason for this. For Guénon, the age of materialism proper is strictly a period from second half of 19th century until the First World War, the era we in Europe call Belle Époque, La Belle Époque, beautiful epoch. And it was belle, because it was a time of unbridled optimism and faith in progress on completely materialist principles. The progress that actually did happen. It was, in a word, an age of certainty. The lurking danger was perceived only by few who were willing to look behind the appearances, as the prophet of nihilism, Friedrich Nietzsche. Here's what this mesosopher saw lying in store for us, distant descendants of Gott ist tot, that is, God is dead, generation. Quote from Nietzsche. The true world, an idea not good for anything anymore, even obsolete, a useless, superfluous, hence refuted the idea. Let's finally do away with it. So, we ditched the true world. What world remains then? An illusory one, perhaps, but no. By teaching the true, we discarded the illusory world as well. End quote. Few Nietzsche's contemporaries could chew on this thought, but today we should know better. The age of materialism was a successful attempt to enclose the world in matter, which means to deny man any knowledge of its original principles, save the lowest. One property of matter is precisely that it provides illusion of stability. It is that stubborn thing keeping us from doing what we want, fettering us in its confines, making us finite, yet at the same time curiously safe. You know, there's no ghosts, no demons, no real fears in its night. And deep, starless night is probably the best metaphor for materia prima. So let's light it up with electricity and everything will gradually become fine. Well, tough luck. That won't work. As Joseph Conrad summed it up in his Heart of Darkness in 1911, where novel's narrator Marlowe describes last words of dying Kurtz, the man who tried to bring enlightenment to murky depths of matter by vehicle of serving as an agent of ivory trade, Il Colgo. Quote, anything approaching the change that came over his feature I have never seen before, and hope never to see again. Oh, I wasn't touched. I was fascinated. It was as though a veil had been rent. I saw all that ivory face, the expression of somber pride, of ruthless power, of craven terror, of an intense and hopeless despair. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried in a whisper at some image, at some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was no more than a breath. Horror, horror. End quote. Those are the final words of the epoch of materialism, the faint cry of man who is an epitome of modern Western civilization. The man that descended into jungle to light it up by electricity and ended his career by becoming local natives' deity and dying of malaria. Indeed, the horror. Because there is no escape from what Guénon calls solidified world. When its security starts to give way, when it starts to crumble or waver like a mirage, both epistemologically and existentially, there is no use invoking the heavens for protection from shadowy shapes that start to slip in through the cracks. The heavens are closed, or, to be true to form, they are infinite quantity of atoms and void. No sound can travel there. So what can a poor boy do then to, as Sigmund Freud famously advised, sing Acheronta movebo. In translation, if I can't reach gods, I'll try to move underworld to pity. This is a quote from Vergilius' Aeneid. The phrase to repeat here is obviously tough luck. Not gonna work. Freud and his psychoanalytic movement serve as a good illustration for mysterious Guénon's term counter-initiation. To understand what it means, we must for a moment shift our attention from cosmology and metaphysics to everyday life of what he calls traditional society. Namely, initiation designates the process of men becoming qualified for enacting some kind of activity. At first sight it may seem like mere apprenticeship, and in Guénon's view this is not so far from truth, provided we are talking about apprenticeship in the real craft, which is in itself something we don't really see in our day and age. Namely, traditional society is an organization of human relations nourished by permanent connectedness to what he calls primordial tradition, or simply tradition with a capital T. The term must be unequivocally taken in its original meaning of tradere, in example, to pass on, because it most emphatically does not mean clinging to historical past, but permanent inner relation to metaphysical origin both of society and of the world itself. In this respect, tradition is sacred in all its forms, and the society true to it doesn't delineate sharply between sacred and profane. Guénon is very vehement to point out that the so-called traditionalism, or teachings endeavoring to preserve or, more precisely, return to previous modes of historical existence, have nothing to do with tradition, with a capital T. Reason is simple. Primordial tradition is eternal being, and not historical sediment. In such society, apprenticeship is both professional and religious initiation, therefore initiation of man into his vocation, through which he can actualize his own inner potential as a participant in a greater whole of society and being in general. To be initiated into some craft, that can be almost anything beneficial to society while observing of its moral and metaphysical foundation, means to be ontologically uplifted. I consider myself a member of perhaps the last generation which was still to some extent provided with a glimpse of this opportunity, only to lose it afterwards. Namely, it was still possible to discover one's own calling and to seek out a master to initiate you in its proper performance. One, for instance, could still realize that school teacher or writer were not merely jobs that anyone can perform, but callings, vocations, to which appropriate people must adhere and be rigorously taught in. However, there were already no more employers who could realize that good teacher is one who, in order to teach, has to have inborn ability to read emotional states of his students, and no publishers who gave a damn about the fact that proper interweaving of words and sentences presupposes a special painful sensibility. Both examples illustrate what Guénon means by being qualified. It is an activity of realizing and expressing the form. Contemporary society, on the other hand, is non-initiatory, in a sense that everybody should be able to do anything. While this was perhaps not so obvious in Guénon's age, nowadays everybody is supposed to be able to change jobs in the matter of few years or even months, while methods of doing them constantly change. In a previous materialistic era, this was displayed in industrialization of workplace and epitomized above all in Taylorism, which sought to create a perfect optimization of workers as completely individualized units. The reason is of course the tendency of quantity to individualize and equivalize everything. And this tendency is directly opposed to any kind of qualified individuality. While traditional craftsmen observe the rule of anonymity as a sign of elevation of individual to higher, trans-individual principle through his activity, the modern concept of anonymity is a necessary residuum of being bereft of all qualifications and becoming the number in the sequence. This drift of any semblance of quality is recognized by materialists at the end of the tether and spawns whole bunch of quote-unquote traditions people long for or try to re-establish. For instance, the journalism, a modern profession if there ever was one, is progressively dying out and there are people who mourn its passing. However, true journalism is based on correct transmission of information, correct reflections of material facts, through simulation of senses, turning journalist into a mediator between the world and the public. But there are no more self-sufficient material facts. Everything that happens in postmodern world is caused by more than material agents, and its significance on the side of public nowadays cannot be appropriated without virtualization. The reality, as Nietzsche said, is no more. There is no point in simply discovering more and more information about misdemeanors of rich and powerful to public of poor and powerless, when both ends of communication channel are progressively dissolving in a quagmire of virtuality. The good journalist never discovered the truth. He merely dug up the dirt. But now the dirt is dissolving too, and this brings us to the scariest part of Guénon's exposition, his concept of counter-initiation. Namely, there is only one primordial tradition, and we can find its origin only through adherence to its historical modes, passed down through religious and or metaphysical teachings of pre-modern world. The tradition of journalism is only one of the pinnacles of modernity, which is now passé, and it very well deserves to be passé. Society bereft of initiation cannot provide opportunity to attain the truth, because the truth is not in matter but in spirit. And reign of quantity passed the phase of materialism exactly to make people forget this fact. This, however, awoke a strange thirst for what now became called spirituality. Guénon notes that his contemporaries started hailing the end of materialism as a great awakening to truth, by appropriating the dissolution of the image of crude matter in new physics and corresponding philosophies as an advent of metaphysics. For the third time, we must repeat, tough luck. Not gonna work. The way downwards leads not to supra or meta, but to subphysics. Not to supranaturalis or supernatural, but to subnaturalis, undernatural, subnatural, not even natural. While initiation served as an entry to a higher realm of supra-individuality, where man opens himself for literary touches of heaven, now we are provided with very real opportunity of counter-initiation, in example, opening of oneself to touches of underworld. In this sense, counter-initiation is not simply a pseudo-initiation where where the real initiation is imitated to no effect but delusions, as is the case for the most part in New Age movement. It is, on the contrary, very real descent into what lies beneath the matter, the effort, and as considerably hard as a real initiation to reach the subhuman levels of spiritual existence. Guénon is vague about historical instances of counter-initiation, which incidentally are the object of what we now call conspirology or conspiracy theory in non-pejorative sense, but indicates too, in his age-budding, psychoanalytical movement. Notwithstanding Freud's appropriation of Virgilian verse about invoking the underworld, qualification of psychoanalysts require the candidate to be analyzed himself, as the aim of this technique is precisely to descend into bottoms or the depths of subconscious, and in some way deal with its muddy bottom. It is clear as a day that initiation into it is a kind of depersonalization, or at least dissolution of waking consciousness that keeps man rooted firmly in the everyday world. However, while in mysticism, which properly presupposes an initiation into reality of one's soul, dissolution of I is not its shattering, but illuminating it from a standpoint which was hitherto not perceived but nevertheless ever present. Psychoanalysis denies any higher standpoint, except as a reflection of ego. The only way open is downwards. Never mind that Carl Gustav Jung rejected Freudian materialism. As far as Guénon is concerned, this makes matters only worse. The inhabitants of underworld are opposite of inhabitants of heaven. The materialism enclosed the world towards upward, and whoever is trying to get in behind appearances, oblivious to this fact, is heading downwards, towards the cracks opening at the bottom. This means that while world is bereft of spirit, it is not bereft of soul, the being able to project and imagine itself in all kinds of ways, hence being capable of delusions. It is therefore no coincidence that cracks are emerging precisely in the realm of psyche. While most of the Freud's followers denied its existence, they could not escape its reality as to give their craft some other name. From the standpoint of sacred tradition, those among them who discovered something immaterial and indeed alive and conscious at its bottom are by far the worst. But as much as psychoanalysis is a good example of terrible practice, it is all old news now. The work of counter-initiation proper has a definite purpose in aping the initiation, hence bringing about counter-quality and unform. It strives not to bereft the world of tradition and truth, but to affirm counter-tradition and a lie. It is the activity of subversion. In conclusion, we will depict how this subversion ensues to bring about the end of the world and ends up only ending itself. Whether the world will go with a bang or with a whimper is a big question of modernity. T.S. Thomas Stearns Eliot's famous sentence on, quote, broken jaw of our lost kingdoms and the world as a valley, quote, valley of dying stars, end quote, is pretty close poetic image to what Guénon calls deviation. The existence of tradition implies that civilization which turns away from it necessary deviates to a point when it begins to develop counter-tradition. In example becomes consciously opposed to its origin. This process is pushed forward by counter-initiation, by which Guénon means activity of producing qualifications for exercising first and foremost the mock spirituality. Intrinsic need of human soul to be illuminated by spirit gets transformed into thirst for spiritual experience, and whoever can provide it is welcomed by the masses. This is an instance of what Guénon calls counterfeit, the being bearing closest possible resemblance to something real, but inverting its sense and purpose, in example its essence, while retaining the appearance. So, for instance, we have a practice of experimenting with religions. Some people change confessions as socks, or, if the money is involved, as jobs, or striving to reach a religious experience. This is counterfeit because experimental method does not proceed from principle and is essentially meant to master something, to gain control over it through understanding. However, religion expresses that which is ultimately higher and cannot be conceived in terms of the lower, as should be the case in experiment, because the experiment is a method of dealing with matter in controlled environment for the purpose of control. There is no way to control the spirit. Therefore, there is no way to experience it too. Counterfeit is essentially pseudo something, a parasite festering on a dead body of what was once a living tradition. One curious aspect of it is its tendency to eradicate the past existence and keep the consciousness of its recipients in the present. In this regard, it is quite similar to a term simulacrum, only it presupposes deliberating will as its creator. Namely, counterfeits exist in order to bring about anti-tradition, in example, pseudo-spirit and pseudo-quality to the world. They are therefore fruits of inverted, but quite deliberate, spirituality endeavoring to mimic reawakening of religion and metaphysics. How would this false dawn look like is something Guénon declines to describe because he considers it imperative only to describe what will inevitably ensue afterwards, namely, when subversion reaches the lowest point, releasing, quite literally, hell on earth, things immediately have nowhere else to go but upwards. Once the lie is absolutely realized, it loses every ground because it can exist only as a parasite on the body of truth. The end of the world is simply a complete revelation of lie as a lie, therefore nothing else but revelation of truth. Once the absolute power is reached, it turns against itself, not seldom in the form of unintentional parody and satire on its own expense. So we can safely conjecture that the end of the world will be very much like a final joke the devil plays on himself, a mockery of the professional mocker. One can notice this in a crucial anti-traditional move of our times, the affirmation of homosexual marriages. As the opposition to legalization of this practice intended to bring down fundamental discernment of sexes and open the floodgates for eradicating any semblance of human image handed down by tradition is forfeit, the opponents are nevertheless left with infinite opportunities to ridicule the consequences of legalization of homo marriages. And ridicule is picking up steam, especially unintentional self-ridicule on behalf of those promoting this part funny, part grotesque piece of social engineering. Once they can't hide behind sporadic violence enacted by opposition, they can't help but show what they truly are. 2. A tedious bunch with insidious intent, naked for everyone to see, including themselves. Exemplary counterfeit called political correctness that served as a tool for deluding the people into belief that they are humane and just by approving of homosexual marriage, displays this unmistakable sign of its pseudo-nature. It is essentially a parody of morality, and once it succeeds in abolishing its object, it has nothing else to parody but itself. But these are only some observations on the present state of affairs. The real horror is probably still on its way, and we can safely conjecture only that it will necessarily be at the same time horrible and hilarious. Everybody knows the world is going to end, yet rarely does anybody know what the world is. Rene Guenon's explanation as to why this have to come to pass is entirely consequent. The world as we know it, is a lie within a lie. The only possible and imaginable way is therefore the end of the lie, the solution of its counterfeits, and re-establishment of order in a way we have no means to imagine in a positive way. Guénon expressed it through Hindu schema of cyclic yugas or ages of the world which express the true quality of time. In example, time as being within 8 telos. As we are living out the end of Kali Yuga or Dark Age, its necessary end must be the shattering of darkness at the darkest hour. A rooster's croak in the night just before the dawn. Taking all the contemporary madness in consideration, we can at least affirm one sure thing about how it's going to sound like a hell of a laugh. So if we are leaving out the great D end, let's give it a laugh. For as things accelerate to free fall, in all due panic, generally masked as euphoria, as well as the free fall is masked as progress, that necessarily ensues, one cannot help but notice how progressively hilarious it all becomes. So why not mock the great mockery until it dissolves into nothing from which it came? Come to think of it, when all is said and done, there is not much else left to do, although it's no small feat to redeem the world by laughing out its counterfeit at the end of its tether. Anyways, if Guénon is to be believed, there really won't be much choice. When whole cosmos realizes that Emperor has no clothes, well, that's really going to be a hell of a laugh. So what else remains than to wish everybody, both readers and listeners, a merry apocalypse and happy new cosmic year.